All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 21, East Asia and Global Perspective. We're looking at Section 2, the Imjin War and Japanese Unification. So as far as the Imjin War goes, this was a war that was fought between Japan and then Korea and China. So this was a war of Japan, essentially, versus Korea and China. It was fought primarily in Korea, and it was a very deadly and devastating war. Japan, as far as how Japan was organized at the time, consisted of different social classes. Near the top, but not quite at the top, were the daimyo, and the daimyo were the local lords. Typically, the daimyo were engaged, especially prior to 1600. The daimyo fought essentially civil wars against each other. You might want to think of this sort of similar to feudalism. That is, local landowners who build castles to offer protection, and in exchange, warriors either fight for them or peasants work on the land. And so daimyo, for a very long time, these local lords really controlled all the power. Daimyo employed samurai. Samurai were warriors who were loyal to daimyo. Typically, each daimyo had a banner, or might even be referred to as a clan. And so in this, feudal period, especially prior, we'll say prior to 1600, it was very common for banners and clans to fight one another in Japan pretty much endlessly. And that's really what characterized the nature of warfare. At the same time, though, there were two other positions that were above the daimyo, and that was either the emperor or the shogun. The emperor was a hereditary system, so passed on by birth, that dated back hundreds of years. The Japanese emperor, though, was not somebody who had a lot of political power, but was very important culturally. So we might say a cultural figurehead. Think of it kind of like a good comparison would be something like the Queen of England today. The Queen of England today is very important culturally. Politically speaking, the Queen of England doesn't have a lot of power, right? That's kind of how the Japanese emperor ruled. So it was still somebody that needed to be acknowledged. It needed to be somebody that daimyo paid respect to. Because they still had a lot of influence in Japan. The Japanese emperor was more or less located in Kyoto. The shogun was the military leader. We might think of the shogun as being, or the shogun, as being kind of like the head, maybe the head or most powerful daimyo, right? So the emperor, cultural figure, the shogun, if one of the daimyo were powerful enough to exert control over all other ones, they assumed title of shogun, which was supreme military leader. Sometimes the shogun and emperor ruled hand in hand. Sometimes they were against one another. And again, throughout Japanese history, it was very common for these daimyo to be fighting each other for control. That started to change in the late 1500s. The Three Unifiers brought Japan together, right? And then 1600 is the kind of main year when the whole Japanese island becomes unified. The first one, Oda Nobunaga, unified central Japan. So he more or less defeated, either defeated or built alliances with many of the daimyo in central Japan. Hideyoshi Toyotomi, he is the second. So first, second. And what Toyotomi is mostly known for was, in fact, the Imjin War and the invasion of Korea. This was to assert Japanese dominance in East Asia. This was to take control of trade in East Asia. But this was also an effort to make sure that the daimyo were not fighting each other more importantly fighting him and instead fighting enemies. And so he led a Korean invasion, right? So this was a Japanese invasion of Korea. And Korea called upon the Ming Dynasty. Recall that the Ming Dynasty is China. Eventually, Japan was forced to retreat. But the war itself left both Korea and the Ming Dynasty in really tough shape, right? So we might say for Korea, it was very devastating. For China, it was very, very devastating, especially for Korea because most of the war was actually fought in Korea. Meanwhile, although a lot of resources by Japan went into the war, Japan emerged out of the war in relatively better shape, at least its economy anyways. And that paved the way for the last of the three unifiers, who you actually see pictured here. And that is, right, number 3, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Right, the last of the three unifiers.